A study of the impact of COVID-19 on the youth and students in the post-school sector shows that food insecurity and mental distress were the main factors affecting them. Among those who were unable to buy food, 10% of them relied on food donation or food parcels, while a further 14.8% did not always have food and sometimes went to bed hungry. Overall, the study showed that the majority of students ate what they could come by or sometimes even spent the whole day without eating. Now, joining us to unpack this further, we are joined by the research specialist at the Human Sciences Research Council, Professor Sibusiso Sifunda. Professor, it's a pleasure talking to you this morning, but a grim outlook according to this study that we see here. Just talk to us about how much of an influence, and a bad one at that, is mental distress and food insecurity among students.
Yeah, good morning and thank you for having me. Yeah, what we actually found, when we did the study, is actually that food insecurity, we sort of expected that in a way, was quite a critical issue. And I think one of the main reasons that led to that, if you look at our data, it shows that it's kind of linked to the students who literally had to leave campuses and go back home. So the issue of almost food that you get in res, almost guaranteed on a daily basis, was suddenly removed because of the hard lockdown, and when people had to leave universities and go back home to their normal situations. And so our data is almost linked when you look at the numbers. Those who said they had to go back home, and then those who say they then had to struggle to get food, is pretty much linked to their circumstances of where they come from. And so it wasn't surprising, but we didn't expect it to this extent. And then with the issue of mental health, even though it was in our major thing that we were trying to find out in the study, it came out very strongly. And we knew that mental health was an issue for almost every one of us. But for students, then it just came out, the numbers were just so high and almost surprising. But if you really look at it and you look at the respondents who responded to our survey, most of them were first years. And so you can see there was a lot of confusion and probably distress based on just having your university career being stopped abruptly like that and being told that you must go back home and now and you don't know when you're going to come back, and it's probably mostly likely linked to that.
Now, Professor, I mean, from what we saw coming out of the study, with nearly 10% of students who rely on donations, nearly 10% of the students who rely on donations, we saw only 10% of the students, rather, who rely on donations for food were able to get those donations. What about the other 90%? It surely makes for a difficult time being a student, trying to find some form of comfort in this very scary time. And as you mentioned, especially if you're a first-year student, it must be quite a difficult thing to have to also face when you are looking at just going about your daily job at hopefully getting education while you're at that.
Yeah, our data is actually showing us clearly that probably the students who were probably in a much better situation were those who live at home normally. There was about 37% of those who said they attend tertiary institutions, but they live at home. So that was probably the most protected segment of this student body, because for them, nothing changed. They just stopped going to campus. But for those who came from other places, or whether you came from another province or you were staying in a different town, so things were really difficult for those. And when you look at that data in terms of where people stay and where you're staying with family or relatives, etc., it shows you very clearly that those who fully depend on the academic institution, whether they live there and they are in res or they get their meals, they were the most affected. And what happens is, if they go back home, most of them come from poor backgrounds. So they now find themselves in the situation of where they come from. And the food insecurities of their spaces now becomes part of their reality, when they may have been cushioned by being in a tertiary institution and being part of the food security systems that exist there, whether it's from NASFAS or it's from the meals you get for being in a university or college residence.
And as you mentioned, Professor, I mean, all of that would then lead to a mental distress of sorts. How about the percentage that didn't have access to internet? I know that almost half of students rely on the data provided by the institutions. 3.5% of those students did not have access to the internet, so as a result they would have been unable to homeschool, if we can call it that. But what was shocking, professors, that 15% of TVET college students say they don't have internet, with a significant fewer amount of TVET students saying that the institutions even provide online learning.
Oh yes, well, TVET colleges actually were probably the most hard hit by this situation, because they basically had no infrastructure to support or even attempt remote learning. If you start looking at the data sets in terms of who was able to learn remotely, universities and private colleges fared quite well, and then the University of Technologies kind of were okay, but not excellent. But TVET colleges basically were one of the institutions where learning just ended, and there was no way. If you look at the indicators we looked at, from the fact of being able to learn remotely or even access to free data from the institutions, which is what some universities and colleges provided, in TVET colleges, all those resources were not there. So for them, they only had to wait until they could go back to campus to be able to learn in some form. And so they, in that sector, this was really probably the worst hit sector of the higher education sector. And even if you look at their response to the survey itself, they were the most difficult people to get to respond, since we're doing this online. And it should, what they respond and tell us is exactly what we experience, because we're tracking who's responding to this survey and where are they. And for like 2 months, we had like less than 2% of people who are responding and saying we are in a TVET institution. So it's coming out of their data, but it's also coming out on our experience of conducting this survey, that they did not have the facilities, nor the resources to be able to participate in the survey. So they couldn't even learn remotely.
So what the survey does for us, Professor, it paints a picture of what students are currently facing. It also gives us an opportunity to fix the problems that they're currently facing. In your view, what would some of those solutions look like?
Well, I think that this really shows the disparities in terms of resources, who's well-resourced and who's not well-resourced. And we are seeing really that a student in a TVET college is almost a double whammy of disadvantage, because you go to a TVET college sometimes not by choice, because you've got bad metric results. And then you now go to a poorly resourced institution that then further disadvantages you in terms of you don't have proper equipment and resources for you to try and get out of that disadvantaged situation. So really improving information technology resources at TVET colleges and taking them closer to where the other institutions are is the way to go. And basically almost to level the field for everybody, to make sure that you're not disadvantaged beyond your disadvantages that you already faced by finding yourself in the TVET sector.
Professor, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for your time this morning. That's Professor Sibusiso Sifunda, who's the Chief Research Specialist, Human and Social Capabilities Division at the HSRC. Now,